Welcome back to this training on building Microsoft Teams apps and solutions. As a reminder, you can post your questions in the Q&A panel during the live session, and our team will answer your questions there. Yesterday, we covered Teams Developer Platform, Overview, and App Lifecycle. Today, we will cover building apps and solutions with Microsoft Teams. Now let's move on to our topic on building apps and solutions with Microsoft Teams, where we'll be covering the following: App Studio Overview, Design Guideline and Best Practices for Apps, Tabs and Tabs Authentication, Building Bots, Messaging Extensions, Message Actions, Task Modules, and Notifications.
Hi everyone, my name is Karthik and I'm a PM here on the Microsoft Teams platform team, working on developer tooling. Today I'm going to be speaking to you about App Studio. App Studio is Microsoft's multi-purpose productivity app that's actually a Teams app that is here to help developers design, build, test, and distribute their Microsoft Teams apps. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what's part of Microsoft App Studio, and then we'll get into some demos so you can see it up and running. Let's get started. A Teams app consists of one or more web apps that are bundled together to present a unified collaboration experience in Teams. Teams understands how these capabilities work together through a JSON-based manifest file. Handcrafting that file is no easy task, which is why we have App Studio. As I mentioned before, App Studio is a multi-purpose Teams app that helps developers design, bundle, test, and distribute their apps. The most important feature of App Studio is the manifest editor. The manifest editor enables app developers to craft the manifest file that describes their app with simple-to-use UI. Once you are done crafting your manifest, you can install your app to your development tenant directly from App Studio. If you are happy with the results, App Studio also makes it easy to publish your app to the public Teams app catalog without leaving the app. App Studio also includes features to help you design your app to make it look and feel like a native Teams app with the card editor and control library. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the manifest editor and then go into a demo. As a Teams app developer, the first thing you must understand is that App Studio is not an IDE. It will not help you build an app. Your code will live in services that are hosted in publicly available URLs. Once you have those services in place, you will need to open App Studio in order to describe your app in the manifest. The manifest editor has an installer that can parse a valid manifest file and understand how an app should look and behave in the Teams client. You will need to use this when you build and test your app in order to install your app to the tenant, group, or just yourself. Lastly, you can refer to the manifest editor's publishing tool to get your app to the Teams app catalog. Let's see what this looks like in action. Now this is the manifest editor in App Studio. As you can see, you are presented with two choices. You can either create a new app from scratch, or you can import an existing app in the event that you've created a manifest file yourself outside of App Studio. If, for example, you're really familiar with the manifest schema required for a Teams app and you just decided to edit the JSON yourself. As you can see, I have 4 apps that I've already imported or created with App Studio. And let's dig into what it looks like to create a new app from scratch. The manifest editor is broken down into 3 different sections: details, capabilities, and finish. The details section of the manifest editor contains user-facing data like the app's name and description, as well as metadata that the end user may not see, like the app ID or the package name that the manifest ultimately needs in order for an app to get built, published successfully using App Studio. So let's quickly go through the information that the manifest expects you to provide. There are obvious fields you need to fill out, like the name of your app, both short and long, as well as the description. This is where you can provide a unique app ID for your app. If you don't have one already, you can use this generate button to generate a unique ID for your Teams app. We do not recommend using this button if, for example, you are going to build a bot or messaging extension for your app. The reason for that is because bots and messaging extensions have bot framework bots that behave under the hood that have their own unique IDs. And in this case, it's recommended that your Teams app ID matches the bot ID that you have registered for your bot or your messaging extension. I'll go into that a little bit later when we go for bots and messaging extensions. In addition to that, we require a package name in the notation that you see listed here, as well as a version number for your bot. Something that we highly recommend you provide is a Microsoft Partner ID if, for example, you plan to publish your app to the public Teams app catalog. You will also need to obviously provide your company name and website if you're going to be doing this. We also require that you link to a privacy statement and the terms of use for your app. We will not be validating these URLs unless you plan on publishing your app to the Teams app catalog. So for testing purposes, you can just put any old URL in here. Okay, lastly, let's go over branding. Now, this will cover the icons that will be used to represent your app in the App Studio or just in the Teams client. As you can see here, I have my own app called Foodly, and there's a hamburger icon that's associated with it. Please use this section of the manifest editor as well as the accent color for your app. Now let's move on to capabilities. As I mentioned earlier, a Teams app consists of various web apps or web services packaged together, bundled, and distributed via the manifest file so that the Teams client can present it to the user. This section of the manifest editor is where you specify the capabilities that are going into your app. This is where a lot of the nitty-gritty work happens. So the most common type of app that you might want to build is a tab. Now, tabs can either be team tabs or personal tabs. A team tab will be installed at the group scope or for the team scope. And a personal tab is one that's only visible to the individual who installs it or for whom it is installed. Now we're going to add a team tab, and the first thing you must do is provide the configuration URL to that team tab. Unlike personal tabs, a team tab requires a configuration page, and this is where you simply point to the configuration page URL for your app. Let's remember that a tab app in Teams is just a website that leverages the Teams SDK. The configuration URL is the URL that provides usually the logging experience for a team or group chat. Now here we can just point to the configuration page for your site. So in our case, I'm going to tell the user to go to contoso.com/config, and the user can update their configuration so they can log out, log back in, or do anything else they need to do. This tab will be scoped to teams and group chats, meaning that an admin or an individual can install a tab for a team chat or a group chat. And optionally, if they plan to host their tab experience in SharePoint, these two checkboxes here allow them to define how their apps will be hosted in SharePoint, whether it's going to be a app page, like a full page web experience, or if it's going to be a web part, a more widget-like experience. Also, that's a good reminder, the configuration page and any hosted URLs must be HTTPS URLs. Okay, I'm also going to add a personal tab. Okay, the entity ID can be any unique identifier for your app, and the content URL will point to where your app is hosted. So I'm going to say that it's going to contoso.com/mysite, and just to make it explicit, it's going to my Teams tab site. So this is a website that has a reference to the Teams SDK. And when the user navigates to this tab-based app, they will be shown the content that is rendered when someone goes to this URL. Now, if they also have an experience that does not include the Teams SDK, and there's another URL for it, then you can enter that here, and this is an optional entry. But what this means is if the user decides to open the tab in an external link, this is the site that will be used. And that's tabs. Let's go over bots. And what you might want to do with bots is come to App Studio before you actually start building your bot. And I'm going to show you now why you might want to do that. So first, we're going to give our bot a name, and this is a new bot. We're going to say that we're going to scope it to just the personal scope and the team scope. So group chats aren't included, meaning this bot can only be installed to a team or available for a one-on-one chat. And I'm going to hit create bot. As you can see, my new demo bot is here, and the application ID corresponds to the app ID for the bot that you see in App Studio. So without App Studio, you'd have to use the Bot Framework SDK or go into Azure and register all this yourself. So this is why this is really handy. And if you, at this point, you can go to wherever you are editing your bot or messaging extension code, copy and paste this app ID, and you are good to go. In order to actually interact with your bot, though, you are going to need a password that you can use to authenticate your bot, and this allows you to do that. Okay, I skipped ahead. I used this generate new password button to generate a new password, and a password was provided. You're going to need this password to build your bot. I'm going to close this now and open up the manifest of an app that I've already created, so you can take a look at a more complete example. Okay, the messaging endpoint is the API endpoint that handles incoming requests to your bot. And this is something you need to fill out. Otherwise, messages going to your bot from the client will have no way of getting to your server. Okay. The command section of the manifest editor is where you list the commands that are available for your bot. Now, this will simply be here to provide UI hints to your user when they are interacting with the bot. For every command here, it's not simply enough to add a command and have it appear here. It's that this is simply a UI construct. Your server-side code for the bot will need to have handlers for all of these. But you're free to go ahead and add commands and help text and specify to which scope these commands should be made available. And when a user goes to interact with the bot, they will be able to see these options are available to them. Okay, connectors are fairly straightforward to set up. If you're setting up a connector for the first time, you will need to register it with the connector developer dashboard, and that's going to take you to an external link. But basically, what that's going to do is allow you to register a new O365 connector. Once you've done that, you can come back here and enter the name, connector ID, and the configuration URL that portal has provided for you, and then you'll be good to go. Okay, now I'm going to jump back and switch to my messaging extension app to go over messaging extensions in App Studio. Okay, as you can see, there is a bot ID. Now, messaging extensions rely on bots in order to function. And if we didn't have one here, you would be creating a brand new bot that follows the exact same model as when you are creating a brand new bot here. I've already done that. So we have a bot, I have an app ID, and I have a password that I've saved in my local development environment, and I have the message handler endpoint for this messaging extension. Commands work the same way as in bots, but there's an important distinction now. Messaging extensions can either be search-based or action-based. When you are building a search-based command, you are usually querying some external service to present information to the user. So as you can see here, I have an example of a search-based query. And if we edit that, okay, we can see that I've entered a unique ID for this command, the title of the command as it appears when somebody attempts to interact with a messaging extension, and a description to help them get started. These checkboxes here describe the UI surfaces from which your messaging extension can be initiated. So your options are either the command box, the compose box, or the message itself. Okay, I'm going to skip parameters because they are more relevant when we are doing action-based messaging extensions. Okay, so let's go and see what it looks like to build an action-based messaging extension. Okay, so you can either create your messaging extension from a set of static parameters for the command, or you can go and query an external service from your bot. Okay, that is what it looks like to create a search-based messaging extension. I already have a action-based one created for you here. Let's take a quick look at do stuff. So as you can see, this action-based messaging extension has two parameters it can take. And once again, these are just UI hints for your user. They will need to have appropriate handlers set up in your backend service in order for them to actually do anything. But let's take a look at what this looks like when it's up and running. So I am going to create a message. Okay, so this is the search-based messaging extension, and this is an action-based messaging extension. Okay, and as you can see, the two parameters that we defined in the manifest editor appear here. Okay, now let's go back to the manifest editor. Okay. Lastly, in the messaging extensions section of App Studio, you can also specify whether your messaging extension handles link unfurling. Link unfurling allows your team's bot to unpack a link from a recognized domain when a user pastes it into the message extension window. So, for example, as you can see here, we've registered links that come from the bot framework domain as part in our message handler section. So if I were to paste the link that comes from botframework.com, there should be logic in my app to unfurl that link and present some UI to help the user get more information from that link than simply seeing a URL pasted into the window. You can think of this as sharing a link in your favorite social media app, how you will usually see a thumbnail and some text to go along with it. So this is really here to help you build a more enriching experience for your users. Okay, so if you are finished with defining all of the capabilities that are going into your app, you can optionally go into the languages section and localize your app to different languages. What you need to do is download a template and fill out that template for a language of your choice. All this really means is you get a JSON file where you can enter the name of your app and the description of the app in another language and include it as part of the manifest so that people whose default language is not English can see that app's name and description in another language. The domains and permissions section of the manifest editor is very important. This is where you list the domains that your app should be able to navigate to in a secure way. Now, this is very important, and you want to make sure that you add the domain where your app is hosted to this list of additional valid domains. You're basically whitelisting the domain where your app is being hosted so that the Teams client can reach out to it securely, and it knows that it can trust it. Next, you can optionally request some device permissions from your users. When the Teams client is running, it has access to, for example, the device's camera, microphone, and speakers, and you can use this section to also request access to those features from your app. Next, if you are going to be leveraging either a single sign-on or resource-specific consent, you need to paste the AAD app ID for your app here. And then for resource-specific consent, this is where you enumerate all of the granular permissions that you would like your app to have. For single sign-on, as part of your SSO onboarding process, you will be provided a specific resource URL in Azure. You simply paste that URL here, and that is the end game of SSO with respect to SStudio as far as you're concerned. Finally, we arrive at the test and distribute page of the manifest editor. This is where you can install your app for local testing. As you can see here, as soon as I hit install, the add button appears in my window. I've already installed this app, so I'm not going to. If you are sharing an instance of App Studio with a partner, you can download the manifest file here as a zip file and distribute it. This is also a good place to come if you want to share your app with a colleague. Lastly, if you have installed your app, tested it, you've shared it with your colleagues, they're happy with it, and you're ready to distribute your app specifically to the public, this is where you want to go to publish your app to the Microsoft Partner Center so that it's available for download and installation on Teams clients. And if you hit the submit button, you will see all of the prerequisites that you must go through before you are ready to submit the app to our validation team. This is not instantaneous, but once you hit all these checkboxes and you submit your app, it is sent to Microsoft validation team, and they will inspect your app, and once they've deemed it ready to be published, it will go live. So this is not instantaneous, but this is how you publish it to Partner Center if you don't want to go to the website to do it yourself. Okay, and that is the manifest editor. Now, App Studio is also here to help you design your app to make it look and feel like a real Teams app. So with that in mind, I'd like to go over some of the secondary features of App Studio. And first up is the card editor. Bots, messaging extensions, and link unfurling all use cards as part of their user interaction experience. And if you'd like to play around with the different types of cards that are available and what they will look like in production, this is a great place to experiment and get some code snippets that you can build and copy and paste into your source code to create the cards that you need. So what you are provided with is an interactive card editor and the code snippets that you need in order to produce the type of card that you've expressed interest in producing. So obviously this can be copy and pasted directly into your source code, and you will have what you need to make this type of hero card. App Studio also has a control library. This is also part of the effort to help our developers ensure that their apps look and feel like Teams apps. And let's take a look at what that looks like. This is the control library where you can grab snippets of code that leverage our UI libraries so that you can just copy and paste these snippets into your own code and make your apps appear to be more like native Teams apps. So you can just go here, copy and paste the code that corresponds to the controls that you'd like to include in your app, paste it into your source code, and you're good to go. Okay, that's a wrap. That's everything on App Studio. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a PM on the Microsoft Teams platform team. And today I'll be here to give you an introduction about how to build and distribute your app to app source and just building on Teams in general, some of the tools and resources we provide. All right, so let's get started. I'll be going over mainly 4 sections of the material. The first one is design guideline. I'll go over some of the UI components and best practices that we offer. And the second step is test and debug. Again, I'll go over some of the tools we provide you for you to test and debug your app, as well as how to set up a test tenant when you want to sideload your app. For the third section, I'll talk about distributing your app. We have 3 ways to distribute your app, whether to yourself, to your team, to your organization tenant, or into app source. And for the last step, I'll zoom in on publishing to app source because that's a more complicated section. We'll go over some of the validation checklists that we provide you, as well as some of the tools that we have and how to pre-validate your app before submitting. So if you open our documentation, you will land somewhere like this. We have just completely revamped our structure of the documentation. So everything is by component. You will see everything about your app under concept, everything regarding message extension in the next section, bots in the third, and tabs over here. And you also have modules, cards, webhook, and connectors. So to find the design guidelines for each component, you want to click into each of them, and then you will see a section of design your tabs, and that will tell you some of the things to keep in mind as you're designing it, some of the guidelines and our best practices. I want to just spend a little bit of time going over the general design of your app. We always want to focus on scenario first. So when you think about your app, think about the use cases. And on this documentation page, it will go over some of the use cases that match to team capabilities. For example, in what scenario you want to use a tab, in what scenario you want to use a bot. So make sure you go through them before you even start the design. And now let's jump back to presentation. For the next section, I want to talk about some of the tools and resources we have for testing and debugging. So After you have figured out your scenario and after you follow our guidelines and get the app out, it's time to debug and test your apps. So let's go back to the documentation and we will see some of the tools we provide that will help you to test and build out your app quicker. First thing I want to just go over is you will see a whole build and test your app section on the left rail. Everything here will help you to build your app package and get it published as quickly as possible. One of my other colleagues already mentioned in depth about App Studio. We have other documentation to kind of help you how to create icons and app packages as well. One of the common questions we always get is, after I have my app, where do I upload it to test and debug? So it depends on your tenant. When you go into App Store, sometimes you will see this upload a customer app button. If you have this option, simply click into it, upload your app package, and you're ready to go. But in case you don't have this button, because most of our tenant admin do turn it off, in that case, I want to introduce you to one of the other options where you can get a test tenant for free as long as you're developing on Teams. So let's jump back to the doc again. On the first tab, it tells you prepare your O365 tenant, and this is where you will get your development environment. I'll do a quick walkthrough on how to sign up for account, and you can see how easy and how quick it is. Everything should be done under 2 minutes or so. So in the documentation, we'll link you to this page. You kind of just follow through, choose your region. Here we'll put United States, can put your company, can be anything really, accept the terms and policies. Here are some simple survey questions that you need to fill. Here we'll pick Microsoft Teams and any option you want really. This will not impact anything you get afterwards. Right, so we pick everything we want, we click join. Once that's ready, that's all you need to do. Simply set up your subscription, choose whatever username you want, any domain you want as well. You set up a password here, and the password here is for all of your admin as well as all of the user as well. Here we'll do a simple verification. Once that is done, you're ready to go. You have your administrator. You can add more user to your tenant, and that will be populated into your teams automatically. They will all be joined in a big teams. And on the admin account, you are free to test any app you want. You can upload. All the options will be there. And this tenant will remain available as long as you're developing for team. It's available for 90 days, and as long as you keep developing, it will automatically renew. All right, so for the next section, I want to talk about some of the options when it comes to distribute your app. There are 3 options for you to distribute your app. First one is silo, which is just upload to your teams or for yourself, kind of what we saw at the button in the App Store just moments ago. This is usually used for testing in small scope, or if you just want to share with your friends for fun. The second option is to publish to organization's app catalog, which is also called LOB app. To do this option, you will have to send your app package to your IT admin, and they can upload your app for you for the entire organization. And this will only show up for your organization and no one outside of it. The third option is publish to app source. This is when you want everyone in Teams to use your app. The third option you have is publish to app source. All the apps in app source will show up in the Teams app store we have. And with this option, you will expose your app to the most people. everyone in Teams can see your app if their admin allow it. And again, you can find all of this information in our documentation here, where we talk about all of them in a little bit more detail and show you the next step for doing any of these. Since app source is going to be completely public, we do have a little bit more requirement when you decide to publish the app source. Next, I'll go over how to prepare your app, make sure it's ready to publish. How do you go and publish through app Partner Center, which will then send to our validation team. And then how would you maintain and update your app and some of the resource and option we offer as well. And here we'll go through some of the documentation and checklists we provide you really quickly. So under Publish Your App to App Source, under Prepare Your App, there are steps listed out here on what you need to do. And for preparing your app, there are certain checklists we provide depending on which requirement you're looking at. For the app detail page or for some common fail test scenarios. So definitely go through these before you submit to Partner Center. Okay, so the next step I want to show you is just a quick walkthrough of the Partner Center, how to submit your app on there. Partner Center is super new to us. It was only public last November, but everything is very easy and smooth here. Once you just go through the steps on the documentation, you will need to get an account through the developer enrollment center. And here you enter your address. There are a couple more buttons to click, but once you just move along with the process, I promise it will be very simple and straightforward. Here it's going to ask you for the company information. Go ahead and fill it out. And once you're done with that form, you're already in Partner Center. It will take you to this page where you create a Teams app, name it whatever you want. And then you will have this other left panel popping up. Will show you the packages, and this is where you want to go to submit your app. Once you choose it and then finish loading, it will tell you if there's any errors. And this is a great tool. Once you go fix all of them, you will be allowed to submit, and your error rate will be a lot lower because of these tools. So here is a checklist. And make sure every single column is completed, and that's when you will be allowed to publish. You can put any notes you want. This package will be sent into our validation team, who will get in touch with you very quickly. And they will walk you through the entire publishing process and eventually get your app on the app source. So the last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about maintaining and update your app. And like you have guessed, if we simply go back to the documentation we had, here's a section for after publishing your app. Make sure you are constantly updating them and checking if there's any bugs, user feedbacks. We also offer application Teams app certification program. Definitely check it out as well. And if there's any questions along your entire development process, feel free to reach to us on the support page. We have a couple different avenues you can reach to us. And that is all I have for you. Thank you very much, and happy developing on Teams.
Hi everyone, my name is Loki Mayberg. I'm one of the platform PMs on the platform team here at Microsoft Teams. I'm here to talk a little bit about authentication in tabs specifically. For those of you who are unfamiliar, or you're just getting started in understanding the apps and the app capabilities inside of Teams, there are different capabilities such as bots, messaging extensions, and tabs. Tabs is specifically the area that I will be talking about today, and I'll be talking about how the authentication story has evolved and where we're at today and how single sign-on plays a role in that. So right to the punchline, what's new for developers? We have Azure AD single sign-on support for Teams tabs inside of Microsoft Teams today. So excited to talk about that today, share a little bit about the journey, what we had before and how we got here today. So single sign-on means that you can sign in your users with the same account that they're using inside of Microsoft Teams. So if a teacher signs into Microsoft Teams with their campus email, that is the identity that you will be using to sign in that user into your application. From the user's perspective, this is great. They never have to sign in again. They never have to sign in again on any device, actually. So that includes their phone. So there's no more going to your favorite app inside of Teams and having to fumble around for your username and password just to sign into your phone, into the application on your phone. And finally, we've heard the developer feedback loud and clear that building authentication for Teams applications is extremely cumbersome and it isn't a really good experience. And so really this is the first step in a much bigger initiative where we're trying to clean up our authentication story for apps inside of Teams. And I'll show you at the end of this presentation, it's a much, much better experience for developers to build authentication into their applications. So let's talk about single sign-on. So before single sign-on, we had regular authentication. We had authentication inside of our apps, inside of Teams, and predominantly, well, for tabs specifically, that authentication model was cookie-based. And for some of you who are unfamiliar, there tends to be two major categories of authentication. The first one is cookie-based authentication. That should be pretty familiar for anyone who does any kind of web development. Then there's token-based authentication. Now, single sign-on is token-based authentication, but what we had before, and what we still have it today, is cookie-based authentication. So cookie-based authentication is great. It's easy to get started because you've probably done some type of cookie-based auth before. However, it's not a great user experience for the end user. What you might imagine is a number of things can happen to those cookies. And this is just general for cookies in general. Cookies don't move around. There's no way to sign in to the Teams desktop application and then pick up your phone and start using the application and expect it to work just because you've signed in on your desktop device. Likewise, that same problem extends just to the browser. So just because I'm signed into Teams in the browser and I've signed into apps inside of the browser doesn't mean that I've signed into those apps on the desktop app. So cookies aren't transferable. That's one of the problems with cookies. One of the other problems with cookies is that they're brittle. They can either expire or in the case of what's most common in Teams is the authentication cookie just gets deleted. So what that probably looks like is the user comes back after a long weekend, they boot up Teams, and all of the previous applications that they've signed into that have dropped cookies, those cookies are no longer around and the user has to re-sign in again, and that's not a nice experience. One of the things that we did to kind of improve the cookie-based authentication story is something we called silent authentication. I believe at one point we even called it silent SSO. Silent authentication is really just a step towards SSO, and it was specifically for Azure AD applications. So something that a developer could do was they could, using silent auth, they could pop up a window, a dialog window, and use that window as a way to get a new cookie and close the window really quickly. So what the end user ends up seeing is they go to the app, they might have to click the sign in button. It just quickly pops up a window for about 3 seconds, and then that window closes and they're signed into their app. So again, not a great experience, but that was kind of the lay of the land last year. Finally, we talk to developers a lot, especially our MVP community, and we've heard you loud and clear. Authentication sucks. It's hard to build. It's not fun. A lot of edge cases. So authentication is one of our biggest, most common complaints. And so really, like I said earlier, SSO for tabs is the first part of a much bigger journey that we're taking to improve the SSO story all up for Teams. So a lot of what I'm going to show you today, when we do have SSO for bots and messaging extensions in the future, it's going to look very similar to this. So let's talk about this again. Authentication in 2019. The best you could do, and this is with silent auth, was you start, then, most applications, there's a sign-in experience, then you consent, and then you're finally signed in. So that experience is fine, but the real problem is what happens much later. Like I said, you come back after a weekend, you boot up Teams again, and you have to sign in again. So this is really the problem. Sometime later, you're not signed in anymore. On the same device, you're not signed in, or you're not signed in on your mobile device either. So with SSO, we remove the sign-in screen. You still have to consent, so that still has to happen. But the sometime later part is really the part of the experience that's the most improved. So a user only ever has to consent once with SSO, and then never again on any device. Just because I've done it on one machine doesn't mean I have to sign in again on another machine. That other device remembers that I've already consented to that application before. So before we jump straight into SSO and talk about that in detail, I wanted to just take a step back and just talk about the common personas that are interested in SSO. The end user, pretty simple one. Users just don't want to sign in. They want to skip sign in. They don't want to fumble around on their phone trying to remember their password. It's just a terrible experience. For developers, they just want a better authentication story inside of Teams. So yeah, they want simpler development when it comes to authentication. IT admins want to protect privacy and security through conditional access policies. So specifically, I'm talking about conditional access policies that are device-specific conditional access policies, such as if you have an application that you're building for Teams and you only want Intune enrolled or hybrid joined machines to be able to access that app inside of Teams, you can't do that today. So with SSO, we do actually support device-specific conditional access policies, and that should make a lot of IT administrators happy. So here we go. In comes Azure AD and Teams. So this has been a partnership between the two organizations to make SSO work. And here you go. So specifically, this is about Teams tab authentication. So I'm not talking about bots or messaging extensions today, although I'm sure if you squint, you could see how you could use this for bots or messaging extensions. But today's talk is just about tabs. And so, in comes Microsoft Teams and Azure AD. Specifically, we have a solution now for tabs. So this is not about bots or messaging extensions. It's just about tabs. And this is specifically for Azure AD. So this is about using Azure AD to facilitate single sign-on experience inside of Teams. So for those of you who know or might not know about AD and what that looks like, that essentially encompasses any kind of Active Directory identities inside of your organization or in another organization, or it also includes Microsoft accounts such as Outlook.com. Another point, this is, it's just about Azure AD. So some people often get SSO confused and start thinking that this means that they're going to be able to start logging in with their Google account or with their LinkedIn profile, maybe their GitHub account. Unfortunately, none of that is true. This is just about being able to log in with either your enterprise account or with your with your Microsoft account, like your Outlook.com address. One of the other benefits is much faster loading times. So I'm going to show that off in a little bit, but essentially what we do is we preemptively fetch your authentication, your access token for you. So as soon as the user clicks on a tab, before your application is even finished loading, we've already gone off to Azure AD and we started getting that token warmed up for you. The third bullet point is much easier development. Obviously, for developers, I'll show you what that looks like. I think in the sample that I'm going to show you, it's really only about 7 lines of JavaScript, just for the basic authentication story. This works on desktop and mobile. And finally, all conditional access policies apply with single sign-on. So, like I said earlier, if you want to restrict your application to only be accessed by domain joined or Intune enrolled devices. This will support that as well. Oh, and one more thing before I move on to the next slide. The solution is for single sign-on is just about applications that you've built yourself. So that does not mean that you can just go and take any generic SharePoint URL or even just go and take your Outlook.com URL and throw that into a manifest or into a website and expect that to work. It's the application's job to call our SDK to do the authentication handshake. And so I just wanted to be, super clear about this. This is about building authentication into an app that you own. This is not about getting single sign-on for free with any random website that's out there today. So what does that look like for the end user? Well, this is kind of the experience that they'll see. They only have to consent once. After they've consented, a record of consent gets written to Azure AD. I'll show you how to look that up as well. And it basically says that, in my case, Loki Mayberg has consented to this application getting his email address, to getting his profile photo, and to access his information offline, if that's something that the application wants. And all of that is written as a record of consent. So if I were to go and pick up my phone and use the application, I don't have to consent anymore. I've already done that once. So this experience only happens once. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly jump into one of our little test apps here called TaskMeow. TaskMeow is a little app that my team works on internally to test features. So we click on My Tasks. You'll see how quickly that was. I was instantly into that application. I'll just go back again quick. I'm automatically signed in. There's no sign-in experience needed. One of the things that you will notice is this little banner up here. TaskMeow needs your consent in order to do its work. Really, what's happening in this demo is TaskMeow is allowed to authenticate you, but TaskMeow is not authorized to access my profile photo yet. And this is a really important distinction. Single sign-on is a fantastic tool for authenticating your users. SSO doesn't do anything to make authorizing a simpler experience for you. Authorization, so for example, if your application needs access to mail or calendar, you might be familiar with a server side on behalf of token exchange to get elevated permissions. So in this case, TaskMeow can sign me in. In other words, I'm authenticated. That's what SSO does. But TaskMeow isn't authorized to get my profile photo. So I'm going to click go. I'm just going to accept this. Might be a bug where it shows me this twice. Sure enough. That's our fault. I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to go back to the app quick. There you go. So now it has my profile photo. So again, I'm going to pause here. SSO is great for authentication. However, SSO is not great for authorization. So the authorization story hasn't changed much. It's still the same as it was last year. It's still the same as it is today. In the tutorial that I'm going to be showing you folks, I will show you how to take the authentication token and exchange it to get more authorization to do more work. So jump back into my presentation here quick. Okay. Let's look at SSO at runtime. So for anyone who's familiar with OAuth, this should be very familiar to you. So starting with bullet point 1, the tab has our SDK inside of it. And using that SDK, that tab calls getAuthToken. getAuthToken is the new single sign-on API that we are exposing inside of our SDK. Once that tab calls getAuthToken, it goes to Teams and it tells Teams to get the user to consent. Now, the reason that exchange is important, I'm kind of alluding to something that I'm going to show you in a little bit, but that means that the app, the tab, has to register Teams as a trusted client inside of Azure AD's registration portal, basically telling Azure AD that it's giving permission to Teams to get a token on their behalf. And I'll show you what that looks like. So we're at bullet point number 2. The user has to consent first because they haven't. Then most of the continued exchange that's going to happen as the user keeps using the app is between 3 and 4, where Microsoft Teams basically goes to Azure AD, asks for a token, and it passes that token back to Teams. And so it goes from Azure AD to Teams, and then from Teams, we pass that back to the tab application. So by the time it comes back into the tab application, you have a full access token. You can sign in your user. You can decode that token. You can see their email address, and I'll show you how to do that. And you can do anything you want with that token. In the case where you want additional downstream resources for Graph, like you want mail access or calendar access, and what you have to do is you have to take that token, you have to take it all the way back to your server, and you have to exchange that token server side with something called an on behalf of token exchange to get those additional resources. In the case where your application is not tenant admin consented, you're going to have to show, just like I showed earlier with TaskMeow, you have to show a little banner that says, "Hey, you need to grant additional permissions for these extra features inside of the application." In the case where your application is tenant admin consented, you can just go straight to the server, exchange that token, and then get a token with elevated privileges, and you don't have to have a user consent to those permissions. Okay, so quickly going to just show 3 slides that goes over 3 parts: registering your application in AAD, updating your manifest, and then finally calling our SDK. So let's talk about the Azure AD app registration. So you need to register your application. There are 3 different application types. SSO works with all 3 of them. But for the demo, the tutorial that I'm going to be showing you today, I'm going to be using the 3rd one, which is an application that can sign in users from either an Active Directory identity, such as those inside of an organization, or with a Microsoft account, so like an Outlook.com email address. Once you're done that, you're going to get an app ID. You should store that somewhere because you're going to need that for step 2. And then you need to expose an API. And you need to make sure that you list the domain name of your application, and then you append that domain name with the app ID that you got in the earlier step. Finally, you need to add a scope that Teams will use. Essentially, it's kind of like an API endpoint that we will use to query AAD to ask for a token.
Okay, so let's look at the 3 main steps that is necessary to set up single sign-on. I'm going to be taking you through a sample, but before I take you through the sample, I just wanted to give you guys a quick overview of the 3 necessary steps. There's registering your application in AAD. There's updating the Teams manifest with the information you got from the first step. And then there's finally calling our SDK to get an auth token. So let's quickly look at step 1. Step 1 is you need to register your application in AAD. There are 3 different account types, but for the sample, we're going to be choosing the most featureful account type or application type, and that is an app that'll work for any account in any organization, as well as personal accounts such as Outlook.com or Hotmail.com. After you're done doing that step, you're going to get an app ID. That app ID you should probably copy and paste somewhere in your scratch notes because we're going to be coming back to that app ID. Third, you need to expose an API. The format of the API is going to be API : the domain that you're going to be hosting your application at / your app ID. And then after you're done setting that up, we're going to add a scope to that API. And the scope that we're going to use is going to be called access as user. Finally, perhaps the most important step of all is you need to authorize Teams to get a token on behalf of your application. So there's going to be a section where you can authorize trusted applications, and you're going to add 2 app IDs to that section. After you're done registering your application, you're going to go over to the Teams manifest. If you go to the bottom, or if you don't have this yet, there's going to be a property called Web Application Info. There are 2 properties that you need to add. You need to add an app ID. That's the application ID that we got from the first step, as well as a resource. So this is going to be the API : your domain name / your app ID. And with those 2 pieces in place, the third step is calling our SSO SDK. And this is perhaps the part that we're most proud of. Like I said earlier, authentication can be extremely difficult to get right. We're very proud of the fact that we got this down to a single API call. You call this API, and we'll handle the entire consent experience, make sure the user gets a token, and we'll give that token back to you. So this is a much, much better, more streamlined developer experience. So let's jump into a demo. Before I get into the demo, I just want to talk about some of the resources I'll be using. The first one is the actual documentation for single sign-on. And then the second one is the actual sample code that I'll be walking you through. So with all of that done, let's take a look at the demo. Let's get this started. So before I jump straight into Azure AD, one of the things for local development is I highly encourage everyone to sign up for ngrok. Ngrok is a local tunneling service. And this is going to be necessary for doing any kind of local web development. This basically exposes a web server on your local machine. And we're going to use that as the mechanism that AD is going to be able to talk back to your application. For this demo, I am using a reserved domain. It's a paid upgrade, but it'll allow me to get a subdomain that I can keep reusing. So the way that ngrok works is, let's just go over to ngrok over here. If I run ngrok and I don't include a subdomain, let's just do that quickly here. Run this. Get this set up. You'll see ngrok gives me this GUID, this unique identifier that they're going to put in front of my ngrok domain. And then if I didn't have a paid account, this is the domain that I will be using. But you'll notice it's a little brittle. If I rerun this again, it's going to generate a different one for me. So the problem that I kind of run into when I do local development is that whenever my ngrok restarts, I have to go back into Azure AD and keep updating where my application is being served. By registering for a reserved subdomain, in this case, I have a reserved subdomain at contoso auth. You'll notice it starts at contoso-auth.ngrok.io. I'm going to have this subdomain long-lived, so it's not going to keep regenerating new ones for me. It just prevents me from having to go back to AD and keep changing the subdomain that I'm serving it at. So that's a pretty important first little step. Now with that done, let's go over to AD. I'm going to go into Azure. I'm going to click on Azure Active Directory, or AAD. Click on App Registrations. Let's register a new app. Let's call this one the Vilt app. I'm going to click the third account type, and I'm going to click Register. Here's the first thing you're going to get back is this application ID. Just copy that, go over to your scratch notes and paste that in somewhere, because we're going to keep coming back to that over and over again. Okay, step one, let's click on Authentication. Let's click Add a Platform, Web, and let's add a redirect URI. So in the samples case, it's going to be your ngrok domain /auth/auth end. After that's done, I'm going to click access token and ID token, and I'm going to click configure. Great. Now with that done, I should have a redirect URI. This is just the URL that Azure AD will redirect to, and you can check that out in the code. If I go over here and I click on tabs, you're going to see there's this URL that I've set up here. It's basically where it's the last step after the sign in is done. It's going to redirect to this URL, and that's where I'm going to get the necessary properties back from Azure AD. So with authentication done, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to click on certificates and secrets. Now, normally you don't have to do this step, but in the sample that I'm using, we are going to be requesting additional permissions. And in order to request additional permissions, you do need to have a client secret. So I'm going to just create a new one. Call this one the VILT secret, and never expire. Copy that, head over back to your scratch notes, add that somewhere because we're going to need that again. Make sure that period was necessary. Yeah, it is. Okay, so with that done, let's go over to API permissions. Click Add Permissions, and we're going to add just a bunch of graph permissions here. We're going to just select the first few: email, offline access, OpenID, and profile. And these are going to give us basic information about the user, enough for us to be able to authenticate the user. So I'm going to add permissions. Done. Next, I'm going to click on Expose an API. I'm going to click Add a Scope. Now, before I can add a scope, I first need to define what URL I'm going to be serving this from. Now, if you remember back from my earlier slides, I'm serving this from contosoauth.ngrok.io/my app ID. So remember that part. You need to add your domain / your app ID. Now, with that done, I get to add my scope. And if you remember, that scope that we've decided upon is going to be called access as user. This is going to be the API that teams will call to get access to those permissions we defined in the previous step. Let's make sure admins and users can call that. Just give it some display name and some description. And make sure that it's enabled. Click add scope. Okay, so we have an API, and this API is going to give us these API permissions. The next thing is we need to authorize teams to be able to call this API. So in order to do that, there are two application IDs. If I go over to the single sign-on documentation, and I scroll down about halfway, you can see we've got two app IDs here. Teams has two app IDs. The first app ID is the app ID we use for the mobile and desktop application. So I'm just going to add that here. I'm going to click Authorize Scopes. So I'm going to authorize this app ID to call this API, and this API is going to give me access to those API permissions. So add application. And one more, the next one is going to be for the web application of Teams. And authorize it. Click Add Application. Great. Now, that's everything we've had to get set up inside of Azure AD. Thing to do. If you remember, there are 3 steps. Step 1, set up everything in AD. Step 2, go over to the manifest. So let's go over to that right now. Go over to the manifest, and let's set this up. So I'm going to replace every instance of the ngrok subdomain with the subdomain that I've registered. So you'll see that's going to be the subdomain there, and that's going to be elsewhere in the application as well. Next, we want to add the application ID here. Let me grab that quick. What was that? Add that there and add this here. Done. And then just for this specific sample, we do have some environment variables we need to set up. Remember, in the sample, I am going to be requesting additional permissions. So in order to do that, I need to head over to a file called default.json. This is just where we store this additional information. So I'm going to just add that app ID here. And if you remember, there was that client secret that we generated. We need this secret if we're going to want to ask for additional permission. So let's just copy that in here and set that up there. Now, yeah, normally you don't have to do this step if you're just trying to use SSO for authentication, but if you want authorization, this is going to be an important step as well for the sample. So with all of that done, that's it. Step 3 is let's actually get this application into Teams and get it running. So first thing I want to do is let's just generate a manifest quickly. There's a command called gulp generate manifest in the sample code that'll generate a little plus. Perfect. So go over to Teams. Let's jump into apps. Let's go upload a custom app. Find that manifest that we just created. Let's upload that quick. Add that. And because we haven't started the server, we're going to get a ngrok tunneling screen. I'm going to go over to Off tab. There we go. Failed to complete tunnel connection. And the reason for that is we haven't actually started our server yet. So let's go back to our terminal, type in npm start. Give it a second. And now if I go back here and I go back to that tab, it's actually going to hit my server that's running on my local machine. Great. So in the sample, you'll see some of the output coming through here. So you can see everything that's happening. Here's that little speed bump page. I'm going to click continue. And the consent dialog is going to appear. And see it's requesting permission for some basic information. There's that application we just created. So I'm just going to click accept. So you'll see we've got this token, and this is everything that we need to authenticate a user. That's it, actually. This token is going to be valid. You can use this token to sign in your user. And actually, if I copy this and I paste this into jwt.io, so I want to inspect this token, and you can see all of this information here that I can receive about this token. I can see my name. I can see my preferred username. I can even see the scope that we were using earlier to access all of this information. And for most applications, that's going to be everything that you need to authenticate a user. It's going to be enough for you to sign in a user and understand who that person is. Also, I just want to show you how fast this is now. If I click here and I go back to it, you'll see how quickly I got that token back. That's because we have the token. That's because we're getting the token before this application has even finished loading. So that when this application calls for that token, we already have it ready to give to this application. So that's it. That's actually everything you need for SSO. This should be enough for you to authenticate a user and log them in. Now, obviously, in some cases, you want to grant further permissions. So that's where authorization comes in. For authorization, we need to ask the user to consent for those additional permissions. In this case, I'm going to be consenting for this application to have access to my profile photo. I'm going to click Grant Further Permissions. And I'm going to click Accept. Why that appeared twice, but there we go. And voila. There we go. So this is going to be a token with elevated permissions. If I were to take this token, I could use this token to also get my profile photo information as well. So the first token is everything you need for authentication. And then the second token is everything you need for further authorization. And what we've done here is you can see the output. I took this token. I sent it to the backend for Exchange. So I'm sending it to my server. My server does it on behalf of Exchange. And then it returns, hey, this person doesn't have the permission. So what I do is on the server side, I return back to the client and say, show the user something in the UI so that the user can consent to those additional permissions. And once that's done, that's how this grant further permissions button was enabled. And I was able to use that to get the additional permissions. So now with all of that done and the sample working, I want to actually show you a little bit of the code and just walk you through it. So like I said, there were 3 steps. Step 1, set everything up in AAD. Step 2, update your manifest. And step 3 is call the authentication API. So for that first little step to get that first token, all we had to do was we had to call one single line, and that's this Microsoft Teams.authentication.getOff token. And this handles that entire experience of getting that first token. And this should be enough for most people. For most people who are developing apps who just want to sign in a user, this is all you're going to need. Now, because in the sample, I want to get additional permissions, you can see the rest of the application is broken up into 3 main parts. The first part is sending the token to the backend for Exchange. And this is going to fail, right? So the first time I do this, it's going to fail because the user hasn't granted permissions yet. And then the third part is actually enabling, or I guess initializing the consent button. And this consent button is what opens up another consent dialog. So you can see there's a little bit of work to get for additional authorization, but for the most part, this is all you need to get a token for authentication. You can also go and look at the tabs.js file, and you can see how we're doing the on behalf of Exchange for those of you who are curious what that looks like. That's it. You should have a really nice sample in your hands, and you should have a sample that can show you how to get something for authentication and something for further authorization. And you can see I can come back here and I can constantly get that additional permissions moving forward in an application. Great. So with that done, let's continue with the slides. Oh, so these are just a bunch of additional slides for pictures instead of actually showing you a demo. So let's go over to the slides. Let's look at the constraints. So these constraints are important. This is something to keep in mind when you're talking to customers or partners or when you're just thinking about building an application. Yeah, let's go through some of the constraints. So this comes up a few times. Works for Azure Active Directory. We don't support Google Authentication. We don't support LinkedIn or GitHub. Now, we do have mechanisms to sign in users with Google or LinkedIn, and you can just check out the documentation for that using a regular cookie-based authentication flow. But if you want single sign-on only works with Azure Active Directory. It's very important to know. The second one is that your Azure Active Directory app needs to match the domain name of your Teams tab. So in the sample that I was showing you, I registered a Contoso auth in AD, and I served my application from Contoso auth. What I mean by that is you cannot have an application running, you cannot register Contoso auth in AD and then run your application at a completely different domain. The domain that you run your application from and the domain you register in AAD have to be the same. And the reason for that is that's how we verify you are who you say you are. That's how we verify that you actually own that domain. And it's kind of like a same origin check, if you will. It's how we know you are who you say you are. If they don't match, I highly encourage you to get a new domain name and make sure that the domain name registered in AAD and where your application is being served from are the same. Unfortunately, we don't support hosting from AzureWebsites.net yet. We are working with the Azure team to lift this security restriction. We're being a little overly cautious, and that's why we were restricting getting a token from this domain. But in the meantime, you can't get a token if your application is running at AzureWebsites.net. This will be fixed in the next few months. Be sure to check out the documentation. Once that's fixed, the documentation will reflect that. Next, it's important that you understand that we can only provide you authentication permissions. What I mean by that is, really, SSO is great for authenticating a user. SSO is not that great for getting authorization for additional permissions. If you need to authorize the user for additional permissions, the developer story around that has not changed. You still need to take the token you get back from the first step, pass it to your server, and do an on behalf of Exchange to get elevated permissions. And finally, depending on when you are viewing this video, mobile is not yet supported. Mobile support is just around the corner, and once mobile is supported, you will certainly know. The documentation will be updated for that as well. So just be aware of that. The mobile support is just around the corner. Oh, before I close out this video, I just wanted to share one more resource. So I've already shared the first two. That's for the documentation, and the second one is for the sample code. But this URL here, this URL here is the one you need to go to in development. Let's go to myapplications.microsoft.com. Let's say I'm done building my app, and I want to rerun through this experience, but I don't know how to revoke consent. Well, the way that you revoke consent or revoke permissions is you go over to myapplications.microsoft.com, click on all apps, and you can see there's that application that we just created. So I can click here, I can click manage your application. You can see those permissions I've consented to, and I can click here to revoke permissions. Now, just be aware that when you revoke permissions, it can take a while. I've experienced it up to an hour sometimes before my permissions are revoked. So just keep that in mind when you revoke permissions. It's not going to be immediately revoked. It's going to take up to an hour before those permissions have been revoked. But after I've revoked it, I can run through this experience from the very beginning. I frequently come back to this when I'm doing development just to test things out over and over again. That's it. Thank you for holding out for this long during this whole presentation. I'm really excited to see the things that you and your partners and customers build using single sign-on in Teams. I think it's a much, much simpler and better development experience. Like you saw, most of the work is actually setting everything up in Azure AD. And then from a developer story perspective, it's very, very simple to get it up and running. So thank you, everyone, and happy developing. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ujasvi Chaudhary, and I'm a program manager on the Microsoft Teams developer platform. Today, I'll be talking about building bots, messaging extensions, adaptive cards, and task modules within Microsoft Teams. I'll start by providing you an overview of the various extensibility endpoints that we have in Teams today. Then we'll deep dive into building bots. We'll start by building a bot, running it locally, and then testing it by sideloading it onto Microsoft Teams. Lastly, we'll cover some end user scenarios, such as mentioning a user via notifications, messaging extensions, or task modules that'll help improve and enhance your application's experience within Teams. So let's get started. So in Microsoft Teams, we have a powerful extensibility platform, and this is a key part of the overall product offering. By building applications within Teams, your users can perform tasks and get things done without having to switch context. So let's take an overview of the various capabilities you have in Teams as a developer. First, we have tabs that you can use to bring content right from your application into Teams. Then there are bots, where you can use messages or actionable cards to talk or reach out to your users in a conversational manner. Messaging extensions allow you to query data right from your application and then share rich cards in a conversation. Message actions. So for message actions, effectively users can send data to your app that you can then use to create workflows. Task modules, these open a dialog from a bot, a card, or a tab. You can use them for form entry, for search, and we'll cover these later in the talk today as well. So notifications are a great way for applications to push data into the Teams app. For example, if a bug is created inside Jira, GitHub, or Visual Studio, and you want your team to know about this, you can set up a connector. Here's an overview of what a typical workflow is like for developing an app inside of Teams. So the first step you do is you define your app within App Studio. You start by creating an app manifest, which is basically a simple JSON file that you use to describe the various capabilities that will exist within your app. A capability is just an extensibility endpoint, like a tab or a bot or, say, a messaging extension. Then the second step is that you leverage the Teams SDK to actually write code and develop these capabilities inside your app. For example, we have a JavaScript SDK for developing tabs. Then we also have SDKs for building bots in Teams. These are in .NET and Node. The next step, then, as you've built the app, you will have to host it somewhere. You could do this either in Azure, but today we'll be doing this locally. The third step is to test your app. You'll need to create an Teams app package for that. Then you take this app package and you can sideload your application into Teams. Okay, now the last step, once you're done with development and testing, you will finally get to distribute your app. So here you upload it to your tenant's app catalog, so everyone inside the tenant has access to it. You can also choose to go ahead and publish it to app source. So I'll start here by giving you an overview of bots. They give you an opportunity to communicate with your users, respond to their questions, and proactively notify them about changes in your application. You can do this inside a chat or a channel. They're built on top of the Microsoft Bot Framework SDK for Teams. and you can use and your bots can complete tasks via commands or natural language. We also support rich and actionable messages via cards, which means that you're not just limited to text when you communicate with users. You can also use rich cards. These cards also have like input controls on them. So, for example, you can have a text box to accept strings, a drop down menu to select a bunch of options, or a button inside a card to get input from your user. You can use them to proactively inform users about important announcements that are happening, or introduce the capabilities of your bot. Fundamentally, they're a great way to reach out to users and teams.
So in order to get up and running with bots, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to head over to GitHub and grab an existing sample for building bots on Teams. Once we're done with that, we're going to use Leverage App Studio to create and register your bot with the bot framework. That process will give us the app ID and password that you will insert back into your dev environment to get things set up. Then we're going to use a tool called ngrok to tunnel in requests back to the local dev environment, and I'll go into details of like why that's necessary later on. Lastly, we'll build an app package and upload the application directly onto Microsoft Teams. So let's get started. The first thing that we'll have to do is we will head over to the Microsoft Bot Builder GitHub samples. So here's the website. And I will have the link towards the end as well. I'm going to grab the sample for the Echo bot, the .NET Core sample. Here it is. And you've got instructions on how to clone this. So I've already cloned the repository and have it available locally inside Visual Studio. The main files that we're going to be working out of are echobot.cs, appsettings.json, and launchsettings.json. Echobot.cs has the activity handler. This is where we have the code for receiving the text and sending it back. Appsettings.json has your Microsoft App ID and the Microsoft App password. We'll generate these shortly. And the launchsettings.json tells you the port at which this bot is going to be receiving requests from. So let's pivot back into Microsoft Teams and create an app package for the bot. So here I'm in App Studio and I'm in the Manifest Editor tab. The first thing I do is I create a new app, and I'll go through the required fields over here. It's asking for a name, so I'm going to call this Echo. I will generate an app ID for it. I'll give it a package name, com.contoso.com, version 1, short description, save, full description. I'm just going to put something over here for the time being. Developer information. And you need to fill in the required fields over here. So the privacy statement and the terms of use. So let's go ahead and define capabilities for this Teams app. Since we're building a bot, we're going to go select bot and we'll click setup. So we will name our bot Echo. And now you have to choose the scope. So this is basically saying where all can your bot be deployed. I'm going to select personal, team, and group. So this enables my bot in one-on-one chats, teams and channels, and group chats as well. Create the bot. Okay, now at this point, App Studio has gone ahead and generated the bot for us. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the AD app ID. What this does it creates a bot and registers it in the backend with bot framework. So grab the AD app ID, head back into Visual Studio and paste it inside appsettings.json. The next thing we need is a password. So we're going to ask App Studio to generate a password for us. Grab this too. the next thing that we need is a messaging endpoint. So a messaging endpoint is basically a place where when your bot receives a payload from Teams, this is the HTTPS URL that that payload will be sent to. So typically this would be the endpoint for your service inside Azure, for example. Today we're going to host this bot locally. So we're going to use a tool called ngrok. So what ngrok is basically going to do is it's going to give us a HTTPS URL that is going to tunnel requests into this bot running locally. So over here, if we go into log settings.json, it tells us that this application is going to run locally on port 3978. So let's open ngrok and tunnel requests through. So I'm going to tunnel requests through to port 3978. And this is working. So let's grab the URL from here. Another thing to note is that the route is API/messages. So we need to append this to the end of our endpoint. So API/messages. Now, if you were to head over to dev.botframework.com, you could see that your bot has been registered there. So here I'm logged in with the same ID that I use inside Teams. I head over to my bots and I see Echo is over here. Under settings, and this is the same HTTPS endpoint that I got from ngrok. And you can also choose to manage the messaging endpoint from here centrally via the bot framework website. Okay, so let's go ahead, build this solution and run it locally. It's running at port 3978 and receiving messages at API/messages. So another thing we can do is we can open, we can monitor the ngrok payload coming in. Good. Okay, now we have the bot running locally and we've got ngrok to tunnel in requests. So let's back into Teams and actually test and distribute this app. So I'm going to install this bot inside a team. So I'm going to click on add to a team. And I have a Echo bot test team, and I will put it in the design and user research channel. And let's set it up over there. Now let's call the bot and say hello. And so the bot is working and it pipes us the same message back. It says hello, hello. Okay, so this is working. So we mentioned the bot receives the message and it's sending the same message back to us. It sends its name and hello. Another thing that might be worth watching through is let's go back into ngrok and let's look at the payload that's coming through. So over here, you see that this was just plain text format. The bot was @mentioned and the text that we got was hello. Another thing that you can see is we've neatly captured out the fact that the bot was mentioned over here. So additionally, you can see that I also have some team specific information in this payload. There is the Teams ID and the channel ID. You can use this information to make your bots more team aware. Now I'm going to run you through some code which fetches the list of channels in a team and prints out the number of channels. So let's copy this. I'll make this available I'll make this sample code available in the PowerPoint deck. I'm heading back into Visual Studio and in the echobot.cs file under the activity handler, I'm going to paste this in. So let's stop the build. So the first thing you see is that we're not able to resolve these methods. The reason being is that we need to import some NuGet packages to make this work. So let's go into manage NuGet packages. We need to search microsoft.bot.builder.teams. and grab Microsoft bot schema.teams. Let's install this. Accept. Now let's go back and see if this gets resolved. So yeah, so we have using Microsoft.builder.teams over here. Another thing I want to call out is that we have a Teams activity handler class over here, and you can which has methods that are specific to Teams. For example, channel created, channel destroyed, or channel renamed. So you can explore these for team specific functions. So let's go ahead and compile this and run this now. So our bot is running again. Let me just open ngrok. So now I'll head back over into Teams and I'll call the bot again. Now this time the bot returns, so the bot echoes back everything that I've said to it, and it returns a count of the number of channels. I have 2 channels effectively in this team. Great. Okay, so now we have everything running. So let me just recap what we did so far. So first we grabbed a sample from GitHub for a simple bot that echoes back what I said to it. Then we used App Studio to register the bot and actually create a bot inside bot framework and then register it with bot framework. Finally, we ran the bot locally and we used ngrok to tunnel request back to the bot. And lastly, we added some team specific modifications inside the bot to make it more relevant to teams. Now we'll look at some design guidelines and recommendations for developing good bots and teams.
So, how do we develop a great experience with bots and teams? The fundamental thing is to make sure that whatever experience you're developing, it makes the most sense for your user. Consider how your bot can easily solve the user's problem with the minimum number of steps. To begin with, you can actually stick to a simple command-based interface instead of using natural language processing. In this case, you can also use input menus to keep your users on Rails rather than having them send you random data. There are also adaptive cards available for sending rich and actionable content to your users, and we'll cover these later in the presentation today. Understand the context that you're operating in. For example, if you're operating in a one-on-one conversation versus being mentioned in a channel, like the use case might be different for your bot in that case. Additionally, here are some team-specific scenarios that are specific to building a bot only inside of Teams. You might want to consider these. The first one is you can @mention users and get their attention. If you @mention users, a notification pops up in their activity feed. So use this if there is some content that is important and urgent that your users need to know about. Secondly, there is this thing called conversation updates. Over here, an event is sent every time a member is, for example, if a member is added or removed from a conversation update event will be sent. This is only true for the conversations for which your bot is a member of. Another great team-specific scenario is message reactions. So let's say that your bot sends a message to a user and they choose to give a thumbs up or a heart reaction to it. In those cases, that information will flow through you via message reactions.
Message extensions allow you to personalize the compose box with your app and services content. Using this, users can query for information or initiate an action inside your application. They do this right from the compose box or the command bar or even the message itself. And I'll demo all of these 3 for you right now. So let's head back into Teams and look at how it's done. So over here, underneath the compose area,
you see all of these various app icons. These are effectively message extensions. So I'm going to look at the Azure Boards extension. And the first thing I see is over here, there are a list of work items. So these are the work items that I had recently interacted with. So that's how the app is ordering it. Let's say I click on the first one, and it inserts a card inside my compose box, and then I can have a conversation around this. Do we need to reconsider this fix? Yeah, so they're a great way of bringing content from outside, from Visual Studio in this case, inside Teams, and then you and your team can have a conversation around this particular bug. Another thing to note over here is that message extensions can also be invoked from the command bar. So let's say, you go over here and then you @mention Azure Boards and it shows up, and then you can search for the bug, searching for the work item. Yep, and here are all of the bugs related to your query. Another thing, so this was the first message extension. This was a search-based message extension. So now let's look at message actions. With message actions, you can let's say, hey, we have a bug. There is a conversation, there is an issue that has come up inside your team. So you click and then you go into more actions, and then you can create a work item right from here. You can create a bug, give it an iteration path and a title, and this generates the bug for you. This is a test bug. I'm going to give it create. So this creates the bug for me, and it also inserts it inside a message. And now you can see that, okay, we've got the corresponding bug in this situation. So this was the second scenario for message extensions. It's an action-based message extension. It's a message action. Let's look at another really neat scenario that we have inside of Teams. So over here right now, I'm in my browser and I'm looking at the same bug. I go ahead and grab its URL and I paste it. I head back into Teams and I paste it inside the compose box. Now you can see that automatically Teams looks at this URL and makes a call to the Azure Boards app and unfurls the link into a card that you can then use to put into a conversation. So, over here, you can see that we've greatly simplified the flow. Instead of the user having to find where this bug was and search for it, they can just grab the URL and generate the rich card type.
Let's head back. Now, today we covered 4 basic scenarios inside of message extensions. The first one was a search-based message extension, where we query data from inside your application and brought it inside of Teams. Then we have action commands. This allows you to grab data from a user. So what you'll do is you'll open a task module and you can have a form inside to grab input. And we'll cover these later in the talks today. Next, we had message actions, where your app can take a specific action on an individual message. And lastly, we covered link unfurling, where we take a link and generate the card associated with that link automatically for the user. Now, how do we build a great experience with message extensions? The first tip that I have for you is that to share content that makes sense for your users in the context of a conversation, since we're starting from the compose box. Secondly, take advantage of rich card types, such as adaptive cards, to create engaging content for your user. Optimize your search results to keep the query snappy and responsive. And lastly, you can use the Bot Framework SDK to build message extensions and add it as a part of your core bot offering. Further, if you choose to, you can just create a message extension by itself. You need not create a bot.
Adaptive cards are another great way to enhance the experience of your bot inside of Teams. They allow for rich and actionable messages. Now I'll jump in and give you a demo of what adaptive cards can do. Head back over into Teams and inside App Studio, go over to the Card Editor tab. We'll choose Create a New Card and select the adaptive card type. So with the adaptive card on the left, you can see the JSON schema associated with this card on the right. When you choose Send me this card, the App Studio bot will set it to you over in the chat pane. So this is a great way for you as you construct your own card to see how it's going to look inside your app. Within the adaptive card, we have some custom input options over here. So you can see that I have the date picker selected in this case, and you can also use a simple text box. Another great resource that we have for adaptive cards is the adaptivecards.io website. Simply head over into the samples section and you can start with a comprehensive set of samples to begin with. I'm going to grab the flight details card, copy the schema. From here, go back into card editor, edit, paste it inside. You can see the card on the right. I'm going to quickly send me this card and it's here in chat. You can just check in. Up next, we have task modules. Task modules are actually a wonderful way to initiate workflows and gather information from the user. Within these workflows, you can collect information via forms and even put media such as videos and images inside them. They're able to surface web content via the Teams JavaScript SDK, or you can send us an adaptive card and we'll render it here. So let's go ahead and look at a demo for a task module. The best example that we have for a task module is the Praise app, which is available to all users of Teams. So I initiate the app. The model of Praise is that there are various badges that you can provide to team members to showcase their contribution in the team. So I'm going to select the coach badge. I will choose a person's name and I will say thanks. You can click preview. It shows you a preview of the card that it will post inside the message. And when you click send, it actually posts the message from you. So over here, you saw how the Praise app popped up a task module and took the user through a step-by-step experience in building out the card. So that is a way for you to use task modules inside your application.
Next steps and resources. So this is all I had today about building bots, messaging extensions, task modules, and adaptive cards in Teams today. If you're just starting out and want to learn more about the platform, I would highly recommend starting with aka.ms Teams Dev Talks to get an overview of what's available in Teams. Additionally, if you want to go straight into developing a bot for Teams, I would start with the GitHub samples in the Microsoft Bot Builder repository. Search for the team-specific samples over there. And here's the 3 lines of sample code that I used in the application earlier today. I hope this session was useful for you. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks for joining us for today's training. See you tomorrow where we'll cover the following: extend your solution with Microsoft Graph.